just getting on the watch page, be able to watch online that you'll have where people and all in the G chat. You Kahal Joseph. .ml. You can also get it just by going kahaljoseph.org, and it brings down, it gives you and Shabbat Matters. And as I speak, I'm just doing the back end and paste up here. It's just loading, and then we'll get started. This class, I'm calling it Trumped, Shabbat versus Special Circumstances. And we're about to see some primary sources on when it is possible to trump Shabbat. So let me just get into and post the file. It's going to be called Shabbat Matters for Trumped. And I'm coming to it right now. There it is. Okay, so it's uploading to the site. And now I'm hitting publish, and anyone should be able to view the file. So here we are, and I'm just going to get started. Oops. That is last week's file. There's 4. There we go. The class has to do with when Shabbat is overridden by other concerns. We'll see that it's both true that there are very few concerns that can override Shabbat, but on the other hand, it seems like, given that that's the case, that there's an awful lot of exceptions to the rule. And this is one of these delicious, and it's one of the reasons that people often feel, quite appropriately, that they need to ask a rabbi and someone with training in the laws of Shabbat for ruling one slice of the exception. Laws of Shabbat work or multiple works addressing with violating concerns of that one for a greater concern. For example, as we'll see, you can in order to help take care of someone who's very seriously ill, in order to save them from losing or possibly even losing their life. So, a great example of that would be like a pregnant person. It's a pregnant woman. You can break Shabbat for her, and you can break Yom Tov for many reasons as well, although it's many of the things you might break Shabbat for, like food preparation and so on, end up being permitted on Yom Tov. There are even some things that are forbidden on Yom Tov that you can violate for the sake of a pregnant woman. I just happened to experience this recently because my second daughter was born on the second day of Yom Tov of Sukkot. And I had to have a lot of that fresh in mind. But I have sitting in my office 2 books about this, and they're probably not the only 2. Big one is called Torah HaYoledet, I think, and the other is called Yad LiYoledet. Big, multiple hundreds of pages of works with halachic sources and so on, talking about each and every aspect of Sabbath violation for the sake of a pregnant lady. And that's just one piece of the greater puzzle of Sabbath violation when a greater concern is involved. So on the one side, you have an overwhelmingly large amount of information about how to break the Sabbath in an emergency situation, essentially. And then on the other hand, if you were to really boil it down into a few principles, you could say it pretty easily. Why are you allowed to break Shabbat? So it's both simple and difficult. And a lot of the difficulties arise from issues that come up in the modern world. We have so many ways of contacting each other and communication. We have so many ways we also have some that need to be done in an emergency, signing treatment or doing some copay and telling him to do a certain procedure. Things in some cases violating the Sabbath. This set of rules on the one hand to take in mind for a greater need, and on the other hand, self-confident and empowered about how to approach one of these situations so that when an emergency happens, you don't do one of two things that are to do them. One, violating Sabbath. I don't know how to deal with this situation. I don't know who to ask. I don't feel comfortable trusting my own judgment. So you freeze and you don't do anything, and then you don't take care of the emergency. Well, that would be too bad. You need to take care of the emergency. The other issue that can come up is someone can just say, well, I don't know how to deal with Sabbath violation, not Sabbath violation. There's so much to keep in mind. I'm just a regular person. I'm just going to violate everything thoughtlessly. I'm not going to try to reduce the amount of Sabbath violation. I'm not going to care. It's an emergency. I just chuck the whole thing out the window. Anything goes. I get a free pass because it's an emergency, and that's how I'm going to deal with this. And that's certainly better than getting frozen. And but if teach people how to have the basic principles in mind, you can give them enough guidance to be able to make a tough call on their own. You don't have time to refer to a rabbi, or in some cases, you can't call them. So you have to be able to make the decision on your own. And you do the best that you can based on certain principles. I'm going to go over some of those overarching principles, and really the details show you how the principles are applied. So I have both some overarching concepts and some very detailed concepts. As with all it's phrased in such a way that if you don't have any background, want to know more, there is plenty more than the 3 pages that I have posted here to be said about this. And so I can definitely help people get more information. As I've said before, I see we have some people watching besides myself. I like to be able to participate live in a class, or even to be able to write a group chat. I'm even seeing in my history of group chat that some people are joining and leaving the group chat. So if you'd like to be able to, oh yeah, here, someone says, I am here, hello. So that person, if you would like to ask a question, people should know, as with all of these, that they're being recorded. And so, okay, to say, I just like to know some knowledge. Fantastic. Well, welcome to the class. I'm delighted to have you with us. If you'd like to ask a question, you may. You should just know it, and I would be happy to answer anything that you have to say. And it is very nice to be delighted that you participate in the conversation. So we're going to just jump right in. Okay, you asked a private, so I'm going to ask you to put your email in the chat, and then to you about private issue offline in a space that's not being recorded, just for your own privacy. So yeah, okay, great. So as I said at the beginning, I don't know if you caught this, that we're working in this class from a source sheet that I'm going to read through and provide explanation for. This is in conversation with my previous classes about the Sabbath, and actually some of the, thank you for your email. We won't get into some of the main Sabbath rules until the session 2, which is too bad, but people have gotten the basic sense of what the overarching idea of Shabbat is. So this class is about when Shabbat can be trumped by a set of special circumstances, usually emergency, and how do you navigate that? So if you're going to download the source sheet, you can go to kahaljoseph.org, That's the name of our website. It's also on the watch page. You can just click the link there. And in the calendar section under Shabbat Matters, you'll be able to download this sheet. So I'm just going to jump right into it. We've got 45 more minutes or so to be able to go through it, or it's less than that. Realizing emergency situation. So the first source I'm bringing is all the way back to the beginning. The Mishnah is the first official book of Jewish rabbinic literature, that is to say. And it says the following: Shabbat. Rabbi Matiash also stated, the pain in his throat, we pour medicine in his mouth on Shabbat, since this is a situation of possible danger to his life. In all cases to life, Shabbat is. It's interesting that the Mishnah reading here is actually a pour Yom day, and it's referring to the day of Yom, which starts with day also. So they're actually talking. A greater issue is like and they're talking Kippur. If there's something else going on, can you break the fast for a certain reason? And that you can see the parallels between breaking the fast and breaking the Sabbath. For many of the reasons that you can break the fast on Yom Kippur, you can also break the Sabbath. For example, if somebody is very ill and they have to take a certain medication, or they'll become very sick, then they're allowed to take that medication. Other rules about breaking Yom Kippur that we won't get into, but it's natural that the subject of violating Shabbat would come out of the discussion of violating Yom Kippur. As if you wrote, so that would seem to be a non-life-threatening illness. That's what it sounds like on the straight read. We don't have to get into the more complicated read here. And you pour medicine in his mouth on Shabbat. So you could. It sounds like you even advise the person, oh, I don't want to break Shabbat, I'm not sure. You can give him this medicine because it's a situation of possible danger. So this is what's called safek nefashot. Perhaps he has some illness that if he doesn't take care of it for the next 24 hours, it become much more serious, especially this being written in an age before anesthetic and modern medicine. Whatever they had available, they should probably take in order to prevent himself from getting worse. And even says, it reiterates, I mean, you'd think it could end right here, but it continues. In all cases of possible danger to life, kol safek nefashot, dohet ha-Shabbat, we suspend the laws of Shabbat. So this Mishnah ends up being very important in framing how we understand Sabbath violation. Probably the biggest single rule about when you violate Shabbat is if there's some type of illness. I wouldn't even say emergency necessarily, because we can see that even sometimes when it's not an emergency, you can violate certain prohibitions of the Sabbath. But the general rule is like if there's a problem with someone's health, the Shabbat can be suspended. And we'll see that there are some limits on that. There's an awful lot of rules of Shabbat. It's like, what if you have a headache, you can start turning on the lights and the other things that are of a minor nature. Certainly at least with electric light, it's much less clear that that violates the Torah than lighting a candle, say. But when you throw out all the 39 melachot, the work labors of Shabbat, because you have a headache, not so much. But once you enter into the area of illness, you have a very powerful source. So the Mishnah is as official as it gets when it comes to an authentic source in Jewish law, and it says you can suspend Shabbat for someone who's ill. So where do we get this phrase pikuach nefesh, which people may be familiar with? Pikuach nefesh means, it's translated as saving a life on Shabbat, but I want to give you the actual case that the phrase comes from so that people can understand it better. We're talking about mapolet, which is like rubble that fell down from some wall crumbling. Some structure fell over and there's this pile of rubble. So Misha Nafila Alav Mapolet, someone that had a bit of rubble fall on them. And now we have some doubt. Safek Husham, Safek Enosham. Let's say you saw a guy standing there and the rubble fell, and now you can't see him. Well, is he in the pile of rubble or not? I don't know, right? Safek Hi, Safek Mate. Maybe you know he's in there, but you don't know if he's alive or not. Maybe he's alive, maybe he's dead. Safek Oved Kohavim, Safek Israel. Maybe you don't know if he's Jewish or not. We'll get into that in a moment. But in any case, no matter what the doubt is, Mifachim alav et hagal. We open up the pile of rubble. So pikuah comes from the term of opening a pile of rubble for the sake of a nefesh, the sake of a soul. So the phrase translates to opening of the pile for the soul. So pikuah nefesh tends to be the term that people use as the mantra of when it's okay to, or the measure of when it's okay to violate Shabbat. Is there a pikuah nefesh or even a safek pikuah nefesh type of situation? Is there a need to open the pile or a doubt as to whether you should open the pile? Then you open the pile. So then we, a little bit of an end bit, it says, Matz'uhu hai mefachim alav. If you find part of the body, based on that one part of the body that it's alive, the person down there is alive, continue to dig until you get him out. The mate, if he's passed away, although it is actually very, not advises you leave the body because taking care of the burial needs is forbidden on the Sabbath. So if it's a doubt, then you can keep going and file. If it's not a doubt and you're certain that we're not talking saving someone's life, and the all bets are off part is off, all bets are on again, and you cannot any longer violate the Sabbath. So saving a life of a Jew versus a non-Jew. This is a difficult topic in Jewish law. We have a certain endogamy, a tendency to marry within ourselves and to value our own culture more than other cultures. And it actually seems quite harsh to say this, but you can't hide from it. The assumption in rabbinic literature is that you should be saving your fellow Jew on Shabbat. Now, is this question because the life of a non-Jew isn't valued as much? I don't think so. They're allowed to dig themselves out on Shabbat. They don't have this prohibition. So maybe the idea here, and I don't know exactly, maybe the idea is that you would expect that this Gentile has friends, and the friends who are not prohibited from violating the Sabbath, because their conception of the Sabbath is totally different from ours, maybe you'll assume that they'll dig him out. And therefore, it's not incumbent upon the Jew to violate his Sabbath for the sake of someone with friends who don't have those restrictions. Well, but then you can imagine, what if he was alone? There was nobody there. You can't just assume that he has friends who will dig him out. So the rabbis came up with this thing that's called mipenei eva, which is that, like, the assumption that other nations who would look at you not saving the life of this person would be so shocked and so hateful towards the Jewish community that we didn't save this person's life, that out of the fear of their reaction to not saving the life, it's incumbent upon us to save the life, even of a non-Jew on Shabbat. And some people like that answer and some people don't like that answer. I mean, it would be nice if we could just say we also have an obligation to save anyone's life, even on Shabbat, no matter who they are. That's certainly how I feel. And I would rush to save anyone's life from rubble if I was able, no matter who they were. And the question is, how do you like the mechanism that was used here? I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, look, we don't have a mechanism lifting a religious restriction on ourselves for someone else's sake, no matter what the moral situation is. So the morally correct thing to do is come up with a weird explanation about why it should be allowed. To me, that makes a lot of sense. But to other people, they don't like that we don't just shoot from the hip and say, look, it's a value to save everyone. So that's a complicated issue in this. But the result is that no matter who they are, Jew or Gentile, you can save them on Shabbat, albeit for different reasons. You can save their life on Shabbat, and that's the origin of the term pikuach nefesh, is opening up the pile of rubble for the sake of a soul. Oops, and I just got an email from somebody who wants to talk to me. I'll talk to her later. Okay, so now we have the basic background from the Mishnah. So this next source from Yoma is, you notice it has the same name. This is the Talmudic commentary on that part of the Mishnah, in part. I didn't bring the whole thing. But the Mishnah is presented in the Talmud in sections, and between each of the sections, there's a longer commentary on it from rabbis that came from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, possibly even as late as the 6th century. They have a much more substantial discussion of the issues that are raised in these sources. I'll read in English for the sake of the people that need that. So it's quoting now the thing that was said before. Since it's a situation of possible danger to his life, we suspend the laws of Shabbat. So it asks an interesting question. Why was it necessary to add that second part? And in all cases of possible danger to life, Shabbat is suspended. Shouldn't that be clear and self-evident from the first part of the sentence? So now we have an explanation as to why that would be. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, not for a possible or not only for a possible danger this Shabbat, but even for a possible danger next Shabbat. That's interesting. We've been talking only within the context of one Shabbat. We assume after Shabbat is over, then you can resume taking care of the person in the normal way and you're done. But he's saying the Mishnah repeated itself and said you can suspend Shabbat in this case, and in all cases of possible danger to life, you can suspend Shabbat. That teaches you this Shabbat and next Shabbat. So he says, how could that be? Let's get an example of what that looks like. If a person was judged dangerously ill for a period of 8 days, so he saw a doctor and the doctor said he's in danger of his life, do such and such, or watch him, or there's nothing we can do, or whatever, but he'll be in danger for 8 days. And after 8 days, if he lives, then he'll be safe. And the first day that happened was Shabbat. So now it's an 8-day period, and you know the doctor has just told you that on the first Shabbat and the second Shabbat, he will continue to be ill and in danger of his life. And so now you have this Shabbat and next Shabbat. So that's a good justification. They're always concerned about extra language in the Mishnah. If the Mishnah apparently repeats itself, it would seem unusual to waste the power of memory on that, keeping in mind that the Mishnah was not initially published as a book. It was published as a guy remembering. I mean, I think there's about 4,500. I'll have to fact check myself later. But it's in the order of thousands of halachot in the Mishnah that each person who learned the Mishnah would have to remember by rote. And so every word that they have to remember uses a big part of your brain to be able to remember the whole thing. And therefore, it's seen as having tremendous language economy to make itself easier to be remembered. And then if it has an apparently extra whole sentence, they're concerned about that. Why aren't we meant to learn something from that, or else it wouldn't have made it into the Mishnah? So now we have a halacha that we could learn from that. To violate this Shabbat and next Shabbat. Okay. You might have said, and that there's the Mishnah and then the Gemara in this case has a lot of concern for what are people's natural assumptions going to be. So your natural assumption might be to say something like, well, let them wait until evening so that 2 Shabbats will not be profaned for this person, right? So what's it, 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon? Like, let's not take care of him until, Shabbat ends around here, 8:45, 8:50 p.m. recently. So what's that? Not even 5 hours away. Let's just wait a minute. Maybe he'll get better, and then we can start taking care of him, and then only 1 Shabbat would be violated for his sake. And so the Mishnah is coming to add this extra sentence to tell us not to say that, even if it is only 5 hours away. Start taking care of him now. Okay, so that's one vignette in the Gemara. So on the same subject, it says, it was also taught, one may warm water for a sick person on Shabbat, be it for him to drink or to refresh him. So it's not even clear that the person needs the treatment in order to physically sustain his body. But let's say he just felt bad. You want to warm water to towel his hair or something. That might make him feel better. The psychological component is important. And it's so important, actually, that you could violate the Sabbath. It's shocking. You could violate the Sabbath for the sake of this person, even if it's not directly to treat the illness. He doesn't need the warm water to drink. He just needs to be refreshed by it. You can do that. And not just this Shabbat, but also the next one. We don't say, let's wait until in case he gets better. Rather, we heed it immediately, since danger to life suspends Shabbat, not only this week, but next week. So it's a similar discussion, but it's about a particular action. We'll see that warming water in particular is an area where you can violate Shabbat more times, because unlike other foods where once they're cooked, and therefore if you end up doing something that causes it to cook more, that in some cases the cooking more doesn't get judged as a Sabbath violation because it was already fully cooked. If you have warm water and it cools off and is no longer warm and you heat it up again, you can use the same pot of water to violate the Sabbath over and over again. It's like there's no limit on the number of times that water can be cooked. So that it would bring up water in this example, warming water, it really shows you how far they're pushing the limit. It's not just, okay, he's hungry, make him some food or something. If you can warm water, the thing that we're most worried about, the potential for violating Shabbat with, then we could do a lot. And then it continues. It says, we don't rely on Gentiles or Samaritans, i.e., we don't say, Christian, can you come warm this water for my friend who's sick? Or Mohammed, can you warm or can you cook a meal for my friend who's got a gangrenous limb or something? And we don't exclude women or here's the part, I'm sorry, the end of that sentence is, rather we have Jewish leaders do it, right? It says, Gedolei Israel. Don't even just take a regular Jew and have them do it. Go find, if you can, like a big person, somebody famous in the rabbinic world, somebody seen as like a holy person, very pious, and get him to violate the Sabbath for the sick person to show everyone, like, this is okay to do. The big guy, the big rabbi, the head honcho on the rabbinic block is violating the Sabbath for the sake of this person. So if he can do it, then we can do it. Really shows you how far they're going. It says, we don't exclude women or Gentiles from weighing in on the urgent necessity of the violation. This is, I'm translating a little loosely. Rather, we add them to the Jewish opinions. So let's say you had 3 Jewish men, and one of them says, this particular treatment, which violates the Sabbath, is necessary, in my opinion, to save this person's life. And the other 2 Jewish men say, no, that's not the case. I don't think it's necessary. So you might think, based on that, okay, well, we're not going to do it because only like a minority of us think that it's necessary. So then along comes a Jewish woman and a Gentile man, say. And so now you have 5 people, and both the woman and the Gentile man say, yeah, we agree with the first guy. Like, that treatment really needs to be done. The sick person doesn't look so good. I think we should do it. So even though in many other cases in Jewish law, it was sort of by the straight letter of the book, we would not accept the testimony of women and Gentiles over the testimony of male Jews. In this case, we do, according to the Talmud. Then that counts as 3 against 2, and you can violate the Sabbath based on majority rules when you're including some people that normally don't have the power to make public decisions in the Jewish legal system. Again, we'll get into the feminist women's rights aspect of that possibly in another course about that subject, because it's a side point in this topic. It does not mean it's not important. So it's bringing all of that information to show how critical it is to violate the Sabbath for the sake of somebody who is sick. Powerful stuff. I mean, if the Talmud had not said it, it might be much more difficult to get that through to people. And there are a lot of stories about rabbis in the Holocaust who would go out in these life-threatening situations. They're the biggest rabbi in town, and they're violating the Sabbath in public to try to save people's lives. They're doing exactly what the Talmud said to do. If you have an urgent situation, you violate the Sabbath to respond to the emergency. So here's another little bit of the Talmud discussing the Mishnah. Most of the first part that I brought was on that first Mishnah. So the second part is now going to the issue of Pikuach Nefesh, opening up the pile for the sake of a person caught in rubble. So it says, our rabbis taught, and this is like an external discussion of the same material. We open a pile of rubble to save a life on Shabbat. The faster, the better. It says, "V'hazariz hareze meshubah." If one rushes to do it, he is praiseworthy. And he need not get permission from the Bet Din, from the court of law. So you should see the pile of rubble and you respond, and you don't even need to ask the rabbis. How so? It wants to know, what does that mean? And it gives several cases, and not treating them all as the same. It gives space in the Talmud to each one of these. Keeping in mind, again, the Talmud initially was also taught from memory and not written down. So the same economy of language issue would apply here. Why are they mentioning all of these as separate cases? To reinforce the point about the necessity of each one. So case one, if one saw a child falling into the sea, he spreads a net and brings him up. The faster the better. And he need not get permission from the Beit Din, although he catches a fish. So that happens to be trapping an animal on Shabbat, especially when you catch a fish, the fish dies, so that it's not getting its own Shabbat. You can save the life of this child who fell into the sea with your fishing equipment, even if you know that's a very likely or even a guaranteed outcome that you'll catch a fish while you're saving his life. You just violate the Sabbath, and you don't need to ask the Beit Din. Case two, if one saw a child fall into a pit, he breaks one segment of wall and pulls him up. The faster, the better. And he need not get permission from the Beit Din, although he makes a step. So the idea is that the pit would probably be lined with courses of bricks or rocks or something, and by chipping out one rock, you would make an indentation that the child or you could use to fish him out of the pool. And making a step and fixing an official piece of walkway is forbidden on the Sabbath, and you don't need to go ask a rabbi. You just make this step and save this kid from being stuck in the pit. Case three, if one saw a door closing on a child, he may break it to get him out. The faster, the better. And he need not get permission from the Beit Din, although he intends to make chips of wood. I mean, when you break the door, that's the thing you're trying to do. You just break it down, and now you can get the child out. So it'll make chips. Go for it, says the Talmud. And then finally, case four, one may put out or isolate a fire on Shabbat to prevent a conflagration. The faster, the better. And he need not get permission from the Beit Din, although he extinguishes the flame. So here's another interesting case. You're not allowed to put out fire on Shabbat because it makes coal, and you can use coal for all sorts of things that would violate the Sabbath, including cooking and other, heating water for various purposes. Making a coal is a Sabbath violation. And so you can put out a fire on Shabbat to prevent a conflagration. So I want to look at the Hadileka. So the idea is that if a structure is completely self-contained, let's say for the sake of argument, you had a big stone walkway where it was just flat stone and nothing combustible for a couple 100 feet in every direction. And in the middle of this, paved area is a very flammable house. And let's say it has a lot of things that are important to you in it, but the likelihood of it catching fire and spreading to the neighborhood is low, or possibly even nil in that case. Technically, you're supposed to just let it burn, even if you care greatly about the objects that are in there. But the assumption is that in almost every case, it's dangerous to let something burn. And essentially the reason you're allowed to put out a fire on Shabbat is actually not about so much that you're trying to save your physical objects, which could be replaced, but rather you're concerned that it would damage other structures, or more importantly, the people living in those other structures. And now you have what we have in the Mishnah before, safek sakanat nefashot. It's a doubt about the danger that someone might lose their life. And so you're actually not putting it out to save the structure, you're putting it out to save the structure from catching another structure on fire and possibly killing or hurting someone. It's a technical thing in there. So I just wanted to bring that part out, is that actually putting out the fire on Shabbat is to save humans from possible future harm, as opposed to saving the commercial objects from harm. And you can also do things like, let's say it's your own house and you don't know how you're going to eat on Shabbat, and you're certain, 100% certain, that it's not going to catch another building on fire, which is, I'm just saying for the sake of argument. The Mishnah does talk about, well, if the thing hasn't burned down yet, go open up the fridge, so to speak, and pull out what you need for your Shabbat meals for the rest of the holiday. Like, you can save things that are necessary to observe Shabbat, but not, things just because they're expensive. Okay, but remember that for fire safety in all modern settings, Rabbi Melhado's recommendation is most definitely, you see a fire, you put it out. It doesn't matter Shabbat or not. Okay, so I just wanted to show you how some of these different principles get ruled in the Shulchan Aruch, the book of Jewish law. So here's the section from Hilchot Shabbat in section 328. I only brought you part of it, and there's so much more to discuss. But we're talking about illness and danger here, and the values of trying to preserve the sanctity of Shabbat against the value of human life, and how do you walk that balance. So the first thing the Shulchan Aruch says is one who's only lightly ill, and the Hebrew phrase is mehush ba'alma, he's afflicted with like a bad feeling, and it's enough that he can walk around like a healthy person. He cannot consume any medical treatment on Shabbat as a rabbinic safety measure against grinding drugs. So let's talk about a couple of assumptions that are written into this. First of all, the Shulchan Aruch was written in the 1500s, the mid to late 1500s, 1560s. And the assumption is if you were going to get any medication, that it was going to be actively ground by someone. It would be prepared by an apothecary who would physically make the medication for you. But as a result of that, the rabbis made a decree that you can't consume already manufactured let's say you bought some before Shabbat. You can't eat this ground medication on Shabbat because perhaps you will get used to eating medication on Shabbat, and you won't remember later that you did that because you pre-made them. And you'll start thinking, okay, it's permitted to grind on Shabbat, and grinding is actually a labor that's against the Torah. So because eating the medicine will accustom you to thinking that medicine can be prepared on Shabbat, you might prepare it on Shabbat and violate the Torah. So you don't even eat the pre-prepared stuff. That's a good example of a rabbinic prohibition. So as a result of this, even today, like if people have a headache, this is a perfect example. You have a headache. Can you have some Advil? The classic rabbinic answer would be no. Don't take the Advil. You just have a headache. You can deal with it. And that will remind you and reinforce you with you that grinding and all of the results of grinding, like grating and other things that can be brought into a finer and finer and finer consistency, mincing very, very fine. All of these behaviors are forbidden on Shabbat. And so you're not allowed to take medication if we're talking about a very light condition. Okay, against the second part, literally the thing that the Shulchan Aruch says right after that, if one's illness puts him in danger, then it's a mitzvah to violate the Sabbath for him. It's a commandment to violate the Sabbath from him, or for him, and the faster the better. And he who writes to ask permission is understood, he who waits to ask permission is understood to be a murderer. That's very powerful language. So on the one hand, we have such a concern for the possibility that I will become accustomed to doing something that isn't even technically permitted or prohibited on Shabbat, but it might make me think that another related behavior is permitted on Shabbat that's not, and therefore I'm not going to treat a certain condition out of respect for Shabbat. On that side, it sounds like, well, you're never going to break Shabbat for the sake of somebody who is ill. Literally, the next rule in the Shulchan Aruch says if they're actually in danger, if there's a problem, then you have to. It's a praiseworthy, laudable, commanded thing to do to violate the Sabbath for him, and don't wait around. And if you do wait around and he dies, that's your fault. You shouldn't have waited for a rabbi. You should have taken care of him. Wow. So the polar opposite, it seems. It really contains both ideas, trying to keep the sanctity of Shabbat in a tough situation versus not freezing and being the deer in the headlights and letting someone pass away who could have been saved if only you had acted faster. Okay, great. So the next thing, which we don't have to read every single word of, is from a book called Fountain of Blessings by, at that time, Dayan, but now Chacham Pinchas Toledano, who's the chief rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam. He was writing this as the Av Beit Din of Spanish Portuguese Jews in England. And he came out with a book in the 80s. It's actually 4 books that says in English what Jewish law is. It's a distillation of Jewish law as it applies to modern conditions. And he has Hebrew sources in the footnotes, which are very good. If you're able to read the Hebrew, you learn a lot more than if you are only able to read the English. But if the English is helpful to you on its own, then that serves as a good guide. So he has some things in here that I think are very important to read. I'm just going to read a few of them because of the time. I want to make sure to get to the end. But you have the rest of them here, and you can always look it up in his book. So this is what he says. First of all, you should set aside Sabbath laws for a seriously ill patient, even if the patient will clearly survive for a short time only. He's called Hayeh Sha'ah, someone who only lived for an hour. So you shouldn't say, well, so-and-so is in the final stages of dying from cancer. The doctors are giving him only a very, very short time to live. He's obviously not even going to make it past Shabbat. Why should I violate the Sabbath for him? And the rule is you don't have the right to make that judgment. If that person needs you to cook him a meal, you cook him a meal. And if that person needs you to do anything for them that violates the Sabbath, medical procedure or whatever, and you think he is certain that he's only going to live for a short amount of time, don't care. You're going to violate the Shabbat for that person. Wow, so powerful. The laws of regarding saving a life apply equally to a fetus and equally to a person who's attempted suicide. So even somebody that doesn't want to live, you have to violate Shabbat to save that person's life, even after they just tried to kill themselves. Okay, and he says this so clearly. I love this from him. There's a lot of lack of understanding and disrespect of mental illness in the Jewish community, in the Orthodox community. And he says so clearly that we should not treat mental illness as something made up. He says there's no difference in this respect between a physical and a mental illness. And therefore, if there's a risk to life from psychiatric causes, the laws of Shabbat should be set aside. So beautiful. And I see that I've left a slight typo in there, which I'll change for the future posting, but you'll see what he's saying on the sheet in any case, even with risk misspelled. So if it is to be understood that if treatment can be reasonably postponed until after the Sabbath, it is prohibited to profane the Sabbath. So this is a good counter argument to what he's been saying before. Violate the Sabbath for all these people, the person who's not going to live for very long, and a fetus, and the person with the mental illness, and da-da-da-da. All these people should violate the Sabbath for. But let's say that someone's feeling suicidal. They've admitted to you that they have suicidal thoughts. And they happen to do this while you're already in the hospital with a psychiatric ward. And all you have to do to save their life is walk upstairs to the psychiatric ward through a stairwell and just give them to the place where they will be monitored 24 hours a day. So you don't actually have to violate the Sabbath for that person once that's happened. You bring him upstairs and you say, look, he just admitted to me that he wants to kill himself. Here he is, right? And now you guys take him and you watch him, and then no Sabbath violation has to occur. So if you could save someone's life without violating the Sabbath and wait until after the Sabbath to do Sabbath violating interventions, it's probably okay. By the way, that example is a theoretical example, so if that ever happens to you, obviously you need to still make sure with medical professionals that indeed that's the correct course of action. But he's trying to show that it's not like everything goes out the window on Shabbat, that if you can minimize or reduce or eliminate Sabbath observance in an emergency, you should try to. So, and then that's what the next one says. Although the laws of Shabbat are to be set aside for a critically ill person, it's advisable to try before Shabbat to anticipate what the sick person might need in order to minimize any desecration of Shabbat. So I remember a time that my father was very ill and he had to go to the hospital, and we thought he might be in the hospital on Shabbat. And even if that hospital had kosher food, that they might need to heat it up for him on Shabbat. So we tried to give him a number of kosher snacks that were not perishable, that would be enough for him to eat over Shabbat, so that no one would have to cook or warm food for him on Shabbat. As it happens, he didn't even need to stay there over Shabbat, but we did that for him so that he would be able to rest there in the confidence that he wouldn't be violating the Sabbath for his meals. That was probably helpful for him. It was a comfort to him that someone cared enough about him to try to do that for him and think about that in advance for his sake, for God's sake. These are a set of things you can do. You don't have to say, oh, well, we'll just bring him to the hospital and then they'll cook for him on Shabbat, because that's permitted for a seriously ill person. You could try to do some things that would make that not necessary if it's not an emergency that just came up like that. If you got sick on Thursday or something, you have the rest of Thursday and Friday morning to be able to figure it out before Shabbat comes. So figure it out. Again, that's the balance. So a lot of these things that I quoted, which I recommend that you read on your own, make the point, go through some of the balance about that. So, for example, numbers 17 and 18 and 19, they deal with preparing food on Shabbat. So 19 says, anything left over of the food that's been cooked on Shabbat may not be eaten by others until after the termination of Shabbat. So let's say you made an omelet for a person who was sick, a cheese omelet on Shabbat, and you put 3 eggs worth and 4 pieces of cheese, and you see that he finished 2/3 of the omelet. And now you're like, man, I'm hungry. That looked like a good omelet. I'm going to have the rest because that food was allowed to be cooked. Okay, yeah, it was allowed to be cooked, but for the sick person, you don't have to eat the omelet on Shabbat. He does. So you wait until after Shabbat. It's not like the omelet's not kosher because it was cooked on Shabbat, but you wait, and actually, he doesn't say it here, but you even wait the amount of time that it would take to make an omelet after Shabbat. And so if it takes you 2 minutes to make an omelet, you wait until Shabbat's over plus 2 minutes and then eat the omelet, because then you could have prepared an omelet like that in the time after Shabbat. You could have, right when Shabbat ended, made the omelet, and 2 minutes later you have a fresh omelet. So that's the first time that you'd be able to eat the omelet for the that was cooked for the sake of this person. And you see, always a set of balances there. So to conclude the discussion of emergencies and so on, I would say that those 2 poles are important things that do make people confused, i.e., how do I know when it's time to say, oh, we need to take care to reduce the violation of Shabbat here and not violate it for the sake of this person in order to have honor and respect for Shabbat, versus, look, this is an emergency and we're not trying to be stupid here. We have to save this person, and we need to not be so caught in that we don't know what to do. So those are the 2 poles. And I would just say that everyone is given a brain by God. Everyone was given a spiritual self by God. And both of those things are going to be applied in this situation. You can use your brain. You can say, look, I judge the situation the following way. I know what the values are. I thought with everything that I had in front of me that the right action was blank. And I did it. And that's fine. And I think the rabbis would not second guess you on that because of all these materials that we've gone through that have said that it's important for you to have the freedom to violate the Sabbath for an emergency. They'd rather you be able to have the freedom to do that and to know that you will be sincerely adjudicating a tough call with your brain and your spiritual self working together. I think they want to trust you, the rabbis do, and I'll include myself in that you're able, just as you face the rest of your life in a mature way and deal with it as best you can, then you can face the question of Sabbath violation with those same faculties, and you should feel the freedom to be able to do that. And maybe after the fact, if you weren't sure, look, Rabbi, I responded to an emergency in the following way. Should I have done different? Or what would you have done in that situation? Fine. So you can talk to a rabbi about that and learn something, and maybe they'll tell you something you didn't know. But the point of this is to trust your judgment and to trust the cooperation of your spiritual and intellectual selves. So end that point on those two. So for the remaining 5-6 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about the issue of Amira La'akum, which means telling a non-Jew to violate the Sabbath for you. And it's raised in part by this question of whether there's a mitzvah, a commandment in the Torah to settle the land of Israel. So it says in Gittin, one who buys a field in Syria is like one buying just outside Jerusalem. So the Gemara wants to know what halacha comes from this statement. So Rav Sheshet says a contract for selling it to a Jew, i.e. a piece of land in Syria, to a Jew can be drawn up even on Shabbat. So for sure it is a rabbinic prohibition to have buying and selling on Shabbat for the very reason that you might write something down. So here you're going to write down a contract to sell a piece of land in Syria to a Jew. And apparently you're allowed to do that even on Shabbat. So then the Gemara is like, on Shabbat? What do you mean? How could you possibly violate Shabbat for this? You're going to write a contract to buy this piece of land? Are you insane? Okay, so the answer is yes. Barabba said he tells a Gentile to do it. So you say, Christian or Muhammad, please write this contract for this piece of land in Syria for me to buy. And then they do the contract and the Jew buys the land on Shabbat. The idea is that it's so important to settle the land of Israel that, maybe if you didn't buy it on Shabbat, this piece of land, and Syria has a sort of Israel-like quality, if you miss this chance, you might miss it forever. So better to buy it on Shabbat by having a contract than miss the opportunity to buy this piece of land at all. Okay. So, and then the conclusion is, although there's a rabbinical prohibition against telling Gentiles to do things on the Sabbath, them meaning the rabbis, did not apply the prohibition to cases of Jewish settlement of Israel. All right, so that raises the issue of, well, are you allowed to violate the Sabbath by telling a Jew, a non-Jew, to violate it for you? So people could read this one of two ways. You can say, look, here's a statement in the Talmud that says you may violate the Sabbath by telling a non-Jew to violate the Sabbath for you. Another completely reasonable way to read it, which is how most rabbis actually do read this, is look, they said most of the time, almost all the time, there's a prohibition on doing that exact thing, like having a Shabbos goy, so to speak, is forbidden. And it's only in the case of missing out on this piece of land that you're not going to be able to buy tomorrow that you can make an exception to the rule, which otherwise stands. And so indeed, that tends to be the case. In other words, if you are not allowed to cook on Shabbat, you can't say, Muhammad, cook my dinner on Shabbat. He's doing it for you. He's not doing it for himself. Even if you said to him, Muhammad, cook your dinner on Shabbat, you can't do it with the idea that he's going to then. That's also, he's doing it because you told him to. And therefore, you have caused the Sabbath to be violated by creating the situation in which a non-Jew violated the Sabbath for you, a Jew. So the rule is that anything that you can't do on Shabbat, you can't tell a Gentile to do on Shabbat either, except in a couple of cases. So the settlement of the land of Israel is one of them. The other one tends to be like if there's a big overriding mitzvah involved. So for example, you need to eat the meal of Shabbat at night. And now you can't do it because you lit Shabbat candles before services and they blew out. And in a pre-electric age, now you have no light all the rest of this evening. And you can't eat in darkness. And so if you don't have a Gentile, if you don't say, Muhammad, turn the light on for me, please, or light a candle for me, please, then you're not going to be able to have the dinner of Shabbat at all. Then you could sort of hint to the person, Muhammad, it's kind of dark in here, don't you think? And he might understand from that you need him to turn on the light. And you do it. So we even try not to him directly, Muhammad, turn on the light. In that case, we try to make him understand that you need him to do it. But it's only when you have like a big overriding mitzvah involved that's allowed. Or, the other classic example, let's say you could only afford to live on the 30th floor of a high-rise, right? And now there's a man who's operating the elevator, and instead of telling him like 30th floor, please, he might say, where do you live? And you could say, I live on the 30th floor, which is just a piece of information that you're stating, and he may understand from that you want him to push the 30 button, and that's permitted because I suppose he could help you up the stairs and unlock the door for you on the 30th floor, and he doesn't want to do that because it's a big trouble for him, and so he is traveling in the elevator, and as long as he is doing it, he's going to bring you with him. These are the ways that like telling a non-Jew is allowed. When there's a big mitzvah on your 30th floor, you're going to have a Shabbat meal or something, or in the dark, you're going to have a Shabbat meal and you need light. But in general, hinting or even arranging in advance, I want to pay you to violate the Sabbath for me. All these things are actually not allowed. And I wanted to, and it's not just out of being, difficult that the rabbis do this. You just think about it for a minute. If you could pay non-Jews, and the world is populated primarily by non-Jews, 99% of the world is not Jewish. If you could pay 99% of the world to do, your Sabbath work for you, it doesn't feel like Shabbat anymore. The Shabbat quality of the day is gone. And the idea is, okay, if you have to have it for some absolutely necessary thing to occur on Shabbat that couldn't occur any other way than involving a Jew, then if you can minimize or sort of maximize the distance between yourself and the labor by not telling him directly, and instead of doing it yourself, you're asking a non-Jew to do it. If you can put some distance from you, okay, fine. But otherwise, and the resting assumption should be that actually that you can't tell a non-Jew to do something you can't do, and it's only if there's an exception that you can. So here's 3 examples, which we'll just read, and then end the shiur with a concluding thought. So number 1, if a person agrees with a Gentile about work to be done and sets the price in advance, and the Gentile does the work for himself, even if he works on Shabbat, it's allowed. So before we then reduce that general statement to a narrower situation, what does it mean that he does the work for himself? So the idea is, let's say the person needs to earn a living for himself. And a great example might be a furniture maker. You need a chair, and you're trying to tell this carpenter that you need him to make your chair. If you say, look, Christian, you make a chair for your job. Your job is to make chairs. Make a chair, and I will buy that chair. So you can make the chair knowing that the materials and the labor that you put into it will be paid off. And it's for this amount of money that I'll pay $200 for the chair. Okay, so that's his work. His job is make a chair, right? It's not like you said, make the chair for me on Shabbat, right? You just said, make me a chair. Make a chair as part of your chair making business. And you just will know that I will come and buy it when you're done. So in that case where he's doing it for himself, for the furtherance of his own business, he's not actually specifically making a chair on Shabbat for a Jew to sit in. This is what it means for to arrange for work to be done on Shabbat with a set wage in advance. So you're just talking about some guidance for this non-Jew about how he runs his business in a way that may cause him to work on Shabbat for himself, but it will result in the Jew benefiting from that labor after the fact. This is allowed, even if he works on Shabbat. And then it becomes reduced even more. When does this apply? In private. So he has his shop and he's working in his shop. Since most people won't recognize that the work being done on Shabbat is for the Jew. But if it's publicly known, then it is prohibited, since when others see the Gentile working, they won't know that they, i.e. he and the Jew, set a price, and they will say that the Jew hired the Gentile to do work for him on Shabbat. So let's say if it was, Like, let's pick a very Jewish name, Saleh or something. Saleh's, shop for having chairs made for Jews on Shabbat is the shingle that they have hanging outside. Then everyone will think that a chair made in that situation is for the Jews, and then you can't do that. That's probably an extreme example, but if you can imagine that there would be a situation where people would just witness what it, and they would make a reasonable assumption. It doesn't even have to mean that they're right, but they make a reasonable assumption that what's happening here is this is a place where work is being done for a Jew on Shabbat by a non-Jew, then it's prohibited. Okay, so that's what we have up till now. Therefore, if one agrees that a Gentile should build a courtyard or wall or harvest his field, then if the work is done in the city or the Tehum, which is a distance of 2,000 cubits outside of the city, and squared off to a round, reasonably sane-shaped polygon, he may not allow the Gentile to work on Shabbat, since those who will see him will not know that a price has been set. And the gloss is from Moses Isserles. Even if the Jew lives among the Gentiles, i.e. you can probably assume that a Gentile doing work on Shabbat is for Gentiles and not Jews. You'd think maybe the guy has a pass, but in this case, no. There remains a concern for guests or family members who will suspect him of violating Shabbat. But if the work was done outside the Tehum, more than 2,000 cubits away from the city, and no other city is within the Tehum of the place where the work is being done, then it is allowed. So you can see from this example, there needs to be quite a bit of distance between the Jew and the work, in this case physical distance, the Jew and the work done. So I'll skip the next one, which is interesting, but I'm running out of time. I'm basically out of time. I'll go to the last one. This is a very common one, a non-Jew lighting a lamp for a Jew on Shabbat. So this is what the Shulchan Aruch says about this. If a Gentile lit a lamp for a Jew on Shabbat, it is forbidden to all Jews, even those whom he didn't have in mind when he lit it. So if I'm using these stereotypically Gentile names. If Muhammad comes into a room and he sees it's full of Jews and he thinks, I'm going to be nice and I'll light the light for all these poor Jews sitting in the dark out of the goodness of my heart because I'm a nice guy, not realizing that this would create a problem. So he lights the lamp and he walks out of the room. So technically everyone in the room who's Jewish needs to leave the room because willy-nilly a light will have been lit for them that they can't use. And supposing on their way out that they ran into another Jew, let's call him Yehuda, so I can keep going with the stereotypically such and such religion names. Yehuda, the Jew, is walking in the room as everyone is walking out, and he says, what's going on? Let's say, well, poor Muhammad, he didn't realize that he shouldn't do that for us, and he lit a light for us, and now we all are leaving the room because he lit the light for us and we can't use the light. Then Yehuda, who wasn't even there when it happened, and therefore definitely Muhammad wasn't thinking about him when he lit the light for them, Yehuda also needs to leave because he's Jewish and the light was being lit for Jews. That's a very powerful statement against having non-Jews do labor for Jews on Shabbat. So there are a few glosses in this. Ramah adds, it makes no difference if they agreed on a price or to do it by contract or with wages. Since the Jew is benefiting from the work itself on Shabbat, it's forbidden in all cases. Couldn't have said it more powerfully than that. But if he lit it for himself, so now this is an interesting question. Now Muhammad is in a room with, later on we learn that it's important whether there's a majority of Jews. So let's say Muhammad and his 10 Muslim friends lights a lamp for himself, and it happens to be that Yehuda and his 5 Jewish friends are in the room as well, and incidentally they benefit from the light. So that might be allowed. So if he lit it for himself or for a Jew who was ill, it is better if we're violating the Sabbath for somebody who is ill and there's no need to demonstrate that Jews could do it. Like everybody around knows that Jews could violate the Sabbath, and you happen to have a Gentile who's there, who's a nice guy and wants to help and is willing to violate the Sabbath for the sake of this person. That certainly reduces the Sabbath violation because now the person doing the work isn't Jewish. So if you have all those circumstances, which sometimes is the case, then why not have the non-Jew, cook the food for the Jew, if all those factors are the case? So now, if he lit this light, which is another thing you could do for a sick person, if he lit the light for himself or for a sick Jew, even if it wasn't a life-threatening illness, and the Ramah adds a very important gloss, or for minors who have the status of those with a non-life-threatening illness. So your resting assumption is that all children, you can violate the Sabbath for them in certain cases. Any case that you could violate the Sabbath for someone with a non-life-threatening illness, you can violate the Sabbath for the sake of a child, which is a major exception in Jewish law, and he reinforces that right here. Then it's permitted for all Jews to use the light. So Muhammad can use the light as long as they are not the majority of the people in the room, because then it might become less clear that Muhammad actually lit the light for himself. Okay, fine. Keeping going. This ruling is the same for a Gentile who makes a large fire for himself or a Jew is ill. But some forbid the fire lest the Gentile add wood for the Jews. So this idea of Shema Yarbeh Bishvilo is an important concept in Jewish law. It's the concept that, let's say, a Gentile really is doing something for himself, but he sees there's a Jew nearby who might benefit from that particular action, the Sabbath violating being done, and he thinks to himself, I'll be a nice guy. I'll violate the Sabbath. Well, it's not even a violation for me because I'm not Jewish. But I'll do what for them is a Sabbath violation, a little more than I might have done for myself so that they can benefit from it. That's the idea of perhaps he'll do more for the sake of the Jew. And we now have a rule that we can't accept such products of a Sabbath violation done in that manner, because we want to try and say, oh, look, I'm sorry, I know you're trying to be helpful, but it actually happens to you. We're still not allowed to take this. Someone did that. I don't think they would be offended if you said that to them, but then the next time they probably wouldn't make more for you. And so they would learn, actually, that you want the Sabbath to be kept for yourself, even as it relates to the work of non-Jews. And then the gloss says, and this is an important gloss, you see it's an Ashkenazi writing this, so he lived in cold countries, and it's important that he says this. However, if the Gentile did it in a Jew's house unbidden, he just walked in the house and lit a fire, and the Jew does not have to leave the room even though he benefits from the fire. So now you're back to practical necessity. There are countries where they really had to employ somebody to come around to the Jewish houses and light fires. It's just, and it gets into the point where it's actually going to endanger their health. If you're in sub-zero temperatures, you can't light a fire on Friday afternoon and not add any more wood for 25 hours and expect the Sabbath to be a meaningful experience, or possibly even a safe experience for the people living in that house. If you have the option to have, a Christian come by and add fire for you, and you can set that up in advance and so on, so that he just walks into your house and does it, and you're not telling him on Shabbat, you need to do this on Shabbat, it ends up actually being better for Shabbat that you have set that up. It's like the Shabbat gets violated in the least bad way for the sake of everyone's Sabbath enjoyment. And that's actually a good way to close this. We're saying Sabbath can be violated primarily for emergency situations or situations that would make it better psychologically for people who are sick, that it can be violated a little bit less for people who are not dangerously sick. And there are some other concerns, like settling the land of Israel, that might theoretically also merit a pass on Sabbath observance. And what we say is encourage people who are in the know to teach everyone that they're allowed to violate the Sabbath, that even big rabbis would violate the Sabbath in these cases, and to publicize that this is allowed, while also saying that if you can minimize the violation of Shabbat and possibly eliminate it as much as possible, that that's better. And we also learned that, contrary to popular belief, it is actually not allowed in almost all cases to ask a Gentile to do work for you that you cannot do on Shabbat, which I think fulfills the first principles that we said. So I think everybody is now clear on when Shabbat can be trumped. And if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call. Take care.